Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome a new contributor. Beatriz Santos is a Portuguese policy writer and a fellow with Young Voices Europe. And Beatriz, it's great to have you on the show. I know this is your first time, but take a moment to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hello, Brian. Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Beatriz Santos. I am from Portugal and I am based here near Lisbon. Currently, I am working for We Are Innovation, which is a global network of over 50 think tanks, NGOs and foundations that are innovation-oriented and focus on problem-solving innovation. And I also have some experience with communications agencies and the European Parliament. I work mostly on the communications field as a press officer, and I am a fellow with Young Voices. I have several articles with Young Voices and on my own published on several media outlets. The most significant media outlet in which I have articles published is a national paper called Observador, but the article we are discussing today is also in a very good media outlet called Brussels Report, which is an article I have done with Young Voices. And I also have 2 published books. And about my coverage areas, so I have been covering a lot this topic of innovation in nicotine because it's also related to We Are Innovation, where we are working. But I am also very interested in international relations and in, for instance, sovereignty, but also innovation-related topics such as technological progress and digitalization.
I'm looking at your article here from Brussels Reports about the EU continues to ignore Sweden's public health successes. Now, we're talking specifically in the area of helping to reduce smoking rates, and I think you mentioned, nicotine. It seems like Sweden has led out, though, in other ways. When I think of healthy countries, for some reason, Sweden always seems to come to mind. Do they deserve that reputation?
Yes. Especially when it comes to smoking, definitely yes. So the case here, and this is what I talk about in my article. So in the last Eurobarometer report on people on Europeans' behaviors towards nicotine, the percentage of Europeans that were smoking was of 24%, the EU average. And when we are talking about smoking, we are talking about cigarette smoking. Combustion, which is the most harmful one. And in Sweden, it happens that the prevalence of smoking in the Eurobarometer report, it appeared as 8%. The report is from 2023. Right now, in 2025, is of 5.3% amongst the entire population, and amongst the people that experience Swedish policies throughout their whole life is only 4.5%. Considering that a smoke-free status requires a prevalence of only 5%, Sweden can consider itself smoke-free. And this actually has public health consequences, very positive consequences. So the cancer rates, particularly the lung cancer rates and also heart disease rates, are way lower in Sweden than the EU average. So there is way less smoking, but there are also way less health problems. So the less the smoking, the less the health problems, in fact. But how did Sweden achieve this? So Sweden achieved this by promoting the acceptability, affordability, and accessibility of alternative solutions that include nicotine, but in a healthier way. So the way of consuming nicotine with a cigarette is way more harmful than, for instance, vaping or consuming nicotine pouches or snus, which, by the way, it's oral tobacco and it's a traditional Swedish method. And In Sweden, these alternatives, so vaping, e-cigarettes, snus, nicotine pouches, are acceptable, affordable, and accessible. I have to remember the whole three, but this is the AAA approach. It's called the AAA approach. By the way, if you want to learn more about that, my organization, We Are Innovation, has a documentary that has recently won two prizes, Best Film and Audience Choice Award at the Global Forum on Nicotine in Warsaw, very recently, 2 weeks ago. And yes, so Sweden has been promoting the accessibility, affordability, and acceptability, accessibility, and affordability of these alternatives and combined with traditional methods, but this is mostly how they achieved such a low prevalence. And the EU and the rest of the countries, instead of following it, are not really doing it. So that's what I approach in my article.
And that was actually the question in my mind. Was how does the EU approach trying to reach that statistical smoke-free status? It sounds like they don't want to allow those alternatives that Sweden is allowing that lead people away from smoking.
Yes, so there are two situations here. There is the general EU situation, and there is the situation in particular countries. But let's start with the EU. So about snus, for instance, snus, which is the traditional Swedish product. Snus is banned all over the EU except in Sweden. And the EU hasn't banned nicotine pouches or vaping, but there is a tobacco. Let me just confirm the name. I mentioned it in my report. Tobacco Products Directive. Yeah, that's the official name. Yeah, there is a Tobacco Products Directive that says that products like snus or nicotine pouches can have adverse health effects. So it's not really going in Sweden's direction, despite Sweden's success, and despite saying, "Oh, these products have adverse health effects," it's not really explained what adverse health effects are. And about particular countries, for instance. There were countries that already banned nicotine pouches, for instance, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. Other countries like Denmark and the Czech Republic are putting up restrictions, Finland and Luxembourg as well, in terms of flavors. So many countries, instead of looking at Sweden, who has very successful results and has basically smoke-free status, are going in the opposite direction. So with this article, well, I don't want to point a finger to anyone. That's not what I intend to do. I would just like to highlight Sweden's example and say, hey, Sweden's example is here. The results are out there, and some countries are going in the opposite way, but they still have time to change. So that's what I would like to highlight in my article.
I love that you point out, too, that snus and nicotine pouches, they're not health products, but they offer healthier alternatives to, the outright cigarettes, etc. Again, we are talking with Beatriz Santos. She is a Young Voices contributor. Beatriz, for those who want to follow your work, tell us again, where can we find you on social media? Where can we find your work published?
Yes, so I write for a Portuguese national newspaper called Observador. You can also find my work on the We Are Innovation blog. I write articles for We Are Innovation. I have this article and the Brussels report, and I also have a lot of articles in my former university's newspaper, but all of them are in Portuguese. But it's called Jornal Desacordo. But if you search my name, Beatriz Gouveia Santos, with the Gouveia, the middle name, we'll probably find out, and you can also look out for me on LinkedIn. I have the links there to my work. Thank you so much.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Mike Viola back to the program. Mike, you have been on here a number of times before, but for those meeting you for the first time, talk to us a little bit about your association with Young Voices.
Absolutely. So right now, I've been a Young Voices contributor for quite some time, but right now I'm its consumer freedom fellow, one of a few. I'm focusing on finance. I'm also write a bit about the history of the Middle East for Young Voices, but we're not talking about that today. But you guys can look up my work if you're interested in that as well.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at an article of yours published on the Foundation for Economic Education's website, fee.org. Buy now, pay later isn't great, but regulation's worse. Now, I guess I lead a pretty sheltered life because, Mike, I hadn't heard of these buy now, pay later businesses. Can you give some examples of what those look like? I suspect I'm not the only person who's kind of like, wait a minute, they're what?
Yeah, it's usually a good sign if you don't need to know about them, but buy now, pay later programs, you may see them called BNPL, I see that acronym floating around, are businesses like, you may have heard of Klarna, Afterpay, Affirm. These are groups that they're not quite credit lenders in the sense of you get a credit card and you have a revolving line of debt. Instead, they are types of lending where by purchase. So if you buy, say, a coffee maker for $100 online, you may get the option to split it up into 4 equal $25 payments. They oftentimes offer zero interest plans that you'll pay off over that 6-week timeline, right? 25 up front and then 25 in another 2 weeks, etc. And there are also plans that let you drag out the payments much longer, but those come with pretty hefty interest rates, sometimes getting into the 30s. So that's what they are. They are not revolving debt accounts, like you may know a credit card that you can use on whatever at any time with a certain interest rate, but they are instead tied to a specific purchase.
Wow. Okay, on the one hand, now I'm starting to realize, no, I do see advertisements for this, or I see, the option of, hey, if you want to buy this now, get it through this with just 4 easy payments. Now I'm starting to realize, well, this has been right here under my nose. But talk to me a little bit about, is this just preying on people with low impulse control, or is there a method to their madness? Is this a successful business model?
Well, so there's a few things to say there. Firstly, while you could think of it as preying on people with low impulse control, and there are many of those people, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily better or worse than credit card providers in that regard. There's a responsible way to use buy now, pay later. If you would have had the money anyway, it doesn't really hurt to spread it out over 6 weeks with zero interest. But just like with credit cards, people will see, say the opportunity to reach, say, a certain credit limit or to break out a payment to what you afford now up front, and you'll figure it out later. And they will take that as meaning you should do that, or you can do that, and there will be no meaningful repercussions. As to your question about whether these have been successful businesses, it's looking a little dicey. Klarna is perhaps the most famous. They are actually Swedish, despite their big uptake in the United States. They had to drop an IPO in April, which they blamed on the Trump tariffs, and surely that may have been a contributor. But they later reported a $99 million loss over the prior year, and that may be what happens when you're able to lend out to people, even in small amounts, without performing any sort of credit check. So they're really assuming a lot of risk there in a way that I don't think will be sustainable on its own in the long run. Klarna, that example, since the article that I wrote at Fee nearly a month ago, they are now pursuing a second IPO attempt, but with that, substantially diversifying their business into other forms of digital banking. Because, surprise, surprise, lending to people with no sort of collateral, say like in the way that you have a mortgage, and no way to charge interest if they default, has not been terribly profitable so far. And they need a few lines of business to make it work.
This sounds like something that would be likely to catch the attention of politicians and regulators. What do they think about these buy now, pay later providers?
Well, the first action that's been taken has been in the United Kingdom. Their Labour government, a left-leaning government, is working on rules that will take effect next year to require those providers to take upfront credit checks and assessments of the people they lend out to. That may sound nice, but what's really going to happen there is the few big existing providers are going to have the resources to do those checks, and they're going to block out upstarts from getting into that world. The dirty little secret about buy now, pay later is that they're not uniquely predatory compared to credit cards, but they're just not great products. They don't have the emergency use cases that credit cards have. They don't give you the rewards. And so ultimately, what's going to happen with buy now, pay later being controlled by just a handful is they're going to be competing on who can get their overhead the lowest in terms of those credit checks, as opposed to say, how do we offer consumers or merchants the most favorable terms to make them want to use our product? And so it's surely in their interest to develop ways to determine whether the people they're lending to can afford to pay them back. I mean, they do want to turn a profit, right? But at the end of the day, decreeing that through the government, while there are already, say, really only 3 or so major providers helping them write that legislation, I don't like the regulatory capture that's clearly going to come from that planning.
No, I think you're right on the money. And you make a very strong case for competition, which sadly, that's kind of become a dirty word in our time. It's almost thought of as, backwards and from a lesser time. People competed, but isn't that really where the consumer battle is won and lost, is who can offer the most for, the lowest price?
Yeah, absolutely. And so with buy now, pay later, they have to compete against each other and they have to compete against other forms of payment. Buy now, pay later is twice as expensive to merchants as accepting credit cards are, because when you think about it, say Klarna or Afterpay, they need to take on the fee of processing your credit card and their other forms of overhead, and they want to turn a profit. So it's not great for merchants. It's not great for responsible consumers, so who can, say, afford higher quality credit cards with good rewards programs. So ultimately, competition would force buy now, pay later to improve. So why get the government involved?
I'm sorry, but I'm having a flashback to whatever it was, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and was it Baruka Salt? I want it now. And I just think,
yeah,
this would be the perfect kind of business to scratch the itch for people who just like, look, I see something I want, I got to have it now. Is there any crossover or any parallel with the payday loan lenders and so forth? You mentioned the word, kind of predatory, and I think that's the first business that comes to mind when I think of financially predatory kind of stuff.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's quite like payday loans in that most people taking on buy now, pay later plans aren't actually paying interest on them. But you see, for example, a majority of people who bought Coachella tickets last year, that's a very expensive music festival. They cost at least $600. A majority of them used buy now, pay later. That doesn't mean they're all paying interest on those plans, but I doubt every single one of them could afford the tickets that start at $600.
So is this the beginning of a wave of payment options or payment services for people? I'm curious if you see some potentially better ways forward that could be found because of this.
Yeah, I think Klarna's moves to diversify its business should be welcomed, right? Maybe these companies can offer buy now, pay later and other options, perhaps to existing customers they have trusted relationships with. There are movements in the credit card industry. For example, Discover was acquired by Capital One. That's probably going to open up their products. And that means, as, say, credit cards expand and get better rewards, you're going to have those competing directly with buy now, pay later. Both products will have to improve. So there are a lot of ways that things can get better for consumers, but it's going to be through less regulation, not more.
Amen. Well said. Talking with Mike Viola. He is a longtime contributor to Young Voices, and we appreciate you guesting on today's program. Mike, for people who want to follow you, where can they find you?
So you guys can find me on Substack or on X, formerly Twitter, as they say. My handle is just my name with no punctuation, Mike Viola.
Great to catch up with you once again. Hope we get to talk again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Great talking to you, Brian.
And And we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Ed Tarnowski back to the show. Ed, you've been on here before, but for the sake of people who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment, tell us who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. My name is Ed Tarnowski. I am a policy and advocacy director for EdChoice, the legacy foundation of Milton and Rose Friedman, and a contributor for Young Voices. And it's always a pleasure to be back.
Well, you know, school choice is one of those topics I like to follow pretty closely. In my home state of Idaho, we finally got a school choice bill passed this year. I've been watching state after state slowly adopting them, but I'm looking at an article you wrote for National Review, and you make a good, strong case here that New Hampshire actually has what probably is the school choice model of the year.
I certainly think it is. And what differentiates New Hampshire here is, for those who don't know, New Hampshire passed an Education Freedom Account program, which is an ESA program, back in 2021. It had limited eligibility, limited by income. But what it did do is it tied its funding mechanism to the state's funding formula. So every kid in the state was guaranteed funding who wanted to be part of the program. They also had a wide use of educational expenses. So parents could use funds not just on private school tuition and fees, but also on other varying expenses, like maybe like therapies or tutoring or curriculum and things of that nature. So what they did this year is they lifted that income cap completely. So in doing so, they meet what we consider true universal choice, meaning universal eligibility, usage, and funding.
Wow. And other states have achieved this to varying degrees. Why is New Hampshire getting so much of it right? Have they had the opportunity to learn from what's worked for others?
I think they have, and what we're seeing in different states are varying degrees of universality. Universal eligibility is in vogue right now, but what we're seeing is oftentimes these programs can be limited by maybe what parents can spend funds on, or if that funding is guaranteed. So I often use Utah as an example. It's an exciting program. In fact, they have one of the best mechanisms for families to use funds. However, the appropriation for the program is quite limited. There's $80 million appropriated for scholarships specifically. So only about 10,000 kids in the state can access the program. So is that true universal is the real question. And I would argue that it's not. And or Indiana, for example, this year they took the final step to lift the income cap completely on their choice scholarship program, which is actually a voucher, not an ESA. And with the voucher, it's just limited to private school tuition and fees, essentially. So they got that funding mechanism and they lifted the income cap. The funding mechanism is also universal. Any kid can access the program, but they do limit more how families can use those funds.
So talk to me about who supported this in New Hampshire and who was the opposition on this particular school choice bill?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will say from what I hear on the ground in New Hampshire, the biggest two issues in this last election were housing and education. Governor Ayak campaigned on universal choice. Most if not all of the Republican members of the legislature campaigned on supporting universal choice or expanding choice. And what we're seeing from opposition is we did see it was a party line vote. We didn't see any Democrats support it, but I will say, with that being said, I have spoken personally with some Democrats on the ground who are open to the idea of choice. And what I am hearing is back in 2021, there was full opposition to the program. But now we're starting to see, when I went up to testify myself, it's interesting how the goalpost has moved from opposing the program completely to this program was meant to be income limited, so we shouldn't extend it to universality. So it's been really interesting to see how people have evolved on this issue. And I think it just shows that they're hearing from their constituents that they want this program.
It's funny, too. I was looking at your article here about Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, New Hampshire, and West Virginia. These are the states that are kind of setting the standard for that marketplace of education. And yet before school choice was passed in Idaho, and I don't think we have nearly as robust a program as any of these states. I know Arizona was being cited as, well, they've had this for a long time. And I believe these are the words that were tested as the most scary in whatever, whatever focus group they used. But Arizona, we were assured, blew a hole in the state budget through this handout to private schools or rich families or whatever it was. But every news story talked about a hole blown in the state budget. It was really interesting.
Oh, we've heard it all. And it's funny. I mean, Arizona's Department of Education just recently had a budget surplus. So this idea that it's blowing up the budget is comical. And the spending that they do have on, I mean, the spending on the ESA program in Arizona is so minuscule in the grand scheme of things. A drip in the bucket in a larger tub. I mean, it's just it's silly, and it's funny how all these the opposition suddenly become fiscal conservatives when it comes to school choice, but they want all their other big spending pet projects. So yeah, it's just it's not based in reality, these claims. It's not what we're seeing. In fact, I mean, the math is pretty clear too here. It's if you take an education savings account for your kid, the state is spending less on that education savings account than what they would be spending if they were in a district school. So just the sheer math of that, any switcher is saving the state money. So it's the math just isn't aligned with these claims.
It seems like one of the big issues too, as you point out, is that at some level, a truly universal system actually trusts the families to choose what type of learning is the best type of learning for a particular child.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's why it's so important that we do talk about true universality, because in New Hampshire, what we're going to see in those other 4 states, it's truly reorienting the system. It's rethinking public education is how I see it, toward away from the idea that public education doesn't just have to be a state-run school or schools run by government, local governments. It doesn't just have to be the school that you're assigned to necessarily. Public education can be the money following the child. And that's what we're doing here, because in guaranteeing all the funding and all the options, then that's truly strengthening the ability to create a marketplace of education. Because if families can take it to where they want, more teachers and other entrepreneurs can come up and be entrepreneurial about new education models. And when the funding is following the student, truly, you're moving away from a monopolistic system where the money is just going where families find this is the best situation for them. So because we've never really seen this before over the long term. And what we're already seeing in Arizona is vast increases in the number of education providers, for example, because there are new schooling models coming up since they went universal back in 2022.
Yeah, that was one of the things that jumped out at me too about Arizona. Was you mentioned in there, the vendors went from 3,000 to over 5,600 or almost 5,600 in just a year when they expanded that universality. And I know there are people out there trying to make money on public education. It's like, but if they're providing the service that people want and are actually seeking, where's the harm?
Right. I mean, profit shouldn't be a dirty word. I mean, if someone is providing a service to someone that's working well for them, remember, this is a mutual benefit here. Someone is consenting to want this type of education. Someone is offering a different schooling model. There's nothing wrong with that. It reminds me of people who screamed about Jeff Bezos making money off the pandemic. But all was happening was Amazon was serving a purpose, stepping in and when people couldn't go out as much and allowing them to order things. So of course we're going to see increases in home orders when people can't leave their homes as much. This idea that was a bad thing when it actually was a net positive for society was always comical to me.
Something else you point out here is this isn't just a phase that we're going through and, we'll grow out of it eventually. The more states that sign on to educational choice, particularly universal educational choice, this is the new reality. And it sounds like New Hampshire is kind of raising the bar and setting the standard nice and high for those states that have yet to implement this.
Oh, I truly believe so. And I don't think it's a phase. I think education choice is here to stay. I think the more the parents are using these programs, the more they're going to want to continue. And the constituents are going to be speaking to the legislators on both the left and the right, saying how these programs are essential to their kids' education and changing their lives. And I think it's just, again, a new way of thinking of public education. And I have a feeling we're not going back.
Again, we are talking with Ed Tarnowski. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Ed, for people who want to follow you or would like to follow your writing, where's the best place to find you?
Absolutely. Well, if you want it, you can always check out my work on Ed Choice's website or follow me on Twitter at Ed Tarnowski. Always happy to answer any questions on education as well.
Great to visit with you. Look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure.